Welcome back. Of course, today is Juneteenth, June 19th. Today is the commemoration of when Union soldiers informed enslaved Africans in Texas that they were henceforth and forever free. Now, Juneteenth only recently has achieved the distinction of a federal holiday, but for many generations, Juneteenth was celebrated by Black Americans in Texas, Oklahoma, and other parts of the country. Now, it's important to note that many Black Americans had their own versions of Emancipation Day across the country. For example, in South Carolina, many Black Americans celebrated Emancipation Day on January 1st, which was the commemoration of the Emancipation Proclamation. Juneteenth, however, like so much else in the class, does have its own history. And I wanted to very briefly share with you an article from Jet Magazine published on July 4th, 1968, about a Juneteenth Solidarity Day that was held in the nation's capital during the Poor People's Campaign. Now, you may have seen in the news lately some arguments about when Juneteenth really became celebrated beyond Texas and Oklahoma. One of the earliest examples of Black Americans from across the country celebrating it together was actually June 19th, 1968. And this is actually from that Jet Magazine article where they had what was called the Juneteenth Solidarity Day. It was a day meant to rally support for the Poor People's Campaign, the culmination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s final dream before he was assassinated in April of 1968. So you can see here that Juneteenth has a lot to do with the political and cultural and social histories that we've been covering in the Modjeska Simkins School this entire semester. And as you may recall, we are pretty close to the end of the semester. So tonight, we are going to get into really the history of the last 40 years of activism and progress and reaction in South Carolina, talking about both GROW and the Progressive Network. And of course, this discussion will be led by Becci Robbins and Bursey. But before we get into that, we have one last thing from last week to talk about, which of course was the experiences of veterans of the Vietnam War and what they actually saw themselves in South Carolina. And so we wanted to lift up those voices too, and then jump right into tonight's conversation about the recent history of activism and progress in South Carolina. So let's go ahead and get to that. Becci, did you want to take the floor on that?
Yeah, this may not, we don't need to take up a lot of time, but I really regret that we didn't have time in the class before when Brett and I were talking about Vietnam, that Keith Gray is at least one of the Vietnam vets we have among us. And I'd invite him and anybody else who served in Vietnam or was an anti-war protester back in the day, just to share their experiences and also give us a sense whether you thought our presentation rang true. And if it, so I invite anybody to, Keith, let's just start with you and then you can hand it off to anybody else.
Okay, thank you. No, I don't have the honor or the trauma of having been a Vietnam vet, but I was very active on the Vietnam protests against the war, but not against the vets. I tried in our protests in University of South Florida make it really, really clear we were protesting the system, the politics, politicians, the old men that sent the boys to die. And USF was a pretty conservative campus up until Kent State, and then all hell broke loose. And like it did in many places around the country. And it really galvanized a lot of people to see our National Guard shooting down American students in a peaceful protest. That was a defining moment. And a lot of us, went from there and kept things going, even if we'd been tied up a lot with classes. And in my case, I even had a young family, but we did what we could for as long as we could. Thank you.
is actually a great segue into tonight's conversation. So for those who may have missed last week's class or may have forgotten about last week's class, what we discussed last week was really how things like the Vietnam War, 2 weeks ago rather, how things like the Vietnam War and the like were important sites of activism and protest in South Carolina. One of the key themes of the Modjeska Simkins course is that we try to center the men and women of South Carolina in the nation's and the world's history in a way that you may not get in other narratives about, say, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement against Vietnam in the 60s and 70s, and so forth. Tonight's class, I think, is the culmination of that lesson. Many Americans tend to think about activism only with certain images in their mind. They think of Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, the anti-war movement. Apparently, in popular tellings of American history, there has been no protest or activism before or since that time. But as we all know, that's not really the case. In the 1970s and 80s, there were men and women on the ground right here in South Carolina who were trying to finish the work of earlier generations of activists and people who resisted the system of white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy in South Carolina. Now, if you have not been to this building, the Grow building here in Columbia, if you look around the room, you will see numerous signs and placards and posters from this era of activism, an era that is incredibly important to understanding the nation in which we live in 2023. But to have a sense of what it was like to be an activist on the ground right here in South Carolina, we are fortunate to have some folks who have been involved in that struggle for decades now. Brett Bursey and Becci Robbins. And they'll be leading us tonight in a discussion of what these movements look like on the ground. And spoiler alert, there may be some surprises that you'll learn about during tonight's lesson, because contrary to popular belief, South Carolina is much more than just a red state on the map every 4 years. There are actually folks here who do give a damn about human rights and have for a long time. And so now I shall turn the floor over to two of those very people right now, Becci and Brett. Mind out of the way.
Thank you, Dr. Greene. I know that y'all have heard me say that I'm lucky to have been raised well, and that I attempted to practice that which I had been taught. And it ended up in repeatedly me being beaten up and put in jail in South Carolina. And so right there is a lesson for you. They wanted to make an example out of me, and I do trust that they have done so. It just wasn't what they expected. But I wanted tonight to not talk just about the things that the Progressive Network and its predecessor Grow and my involvement in the Southern Student Organizing Committee and meeting Modjeska, not just about the chronology, but about the feelings that drove what it is that we did, the strategies that we used, and what we did and learned at the time that's still applicable. What are the lessons we're bringing forward? And I would want to kind of start letting you know that I got back to South Carolina after being underground for a year for spray painting "Hell No, We Won't Go on the Draft Board Wall," which was after I was arrested for burning Confederate flags, which was much worse than opposing Vietnam, and ended up spending 2 years in prison for spray painting "Hell No, We Won't Go on the Draft Board Wall." That case went to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1974, and I had the privilege, rare privilege, of actually having Thurgood Marshall for an attorney. He wasn't really my attorney, but his ruling from the Supreme Court was in my favor. We had oral arguments. That's very, very rare. There's very few people that get oral arguments in the Supreme Court. And the case was because my co-defendant at the university, who did the vandalism to the draft board with me, was a SLED agent, not an informer, an agent, who had been trained and been to the FBI and the CIA camp and all that stuff, and he was really geared up. The lesson there is, boy, howdy doody, did they spend a lot of time to get somebody spray painting "Hello, we won't go on a wall." that's the level of repression that can be turned on in a nanosecond. And there are people, the militarization of our peacekeepers is a true threat to democracy. And we're seeing some good moves in that direction with the pressure and protest and beginning of changes in some enlightened states and some federal legislation. It's being driven by police brutality to people of color. But don't think for a minute that there isn't a capacity there that can be used that's quite frightening. And because I've been there, seen it, and that the results was that the Supreme Court ruled against me, that just because an agent of the prosecution penetrates your defense camp and sits in on your with your lawyer and you while you're planning your defense, does not deny you a fair trial, because the Constitution does not entitle you to private counsel. It entitles you to adequate counsel, and you have to prove what they found out they used against you, which you can't do. So it was very frustrating, but it was really interesting time. So I ended up back in South Carolina, and I'm feeling, I came back thinking that if I could find somewhere that I could live for free 20 miles outside of Columbia. You want to know when I came back?
Yeah.
I think it was the end of 73 or 74. I had gone off after being in prison. The immediate thing I did was start organizing against Nixon to impeach him. And one evening, on my way home in Olympia, when I was renting a little house there, people ran out in the street and stopped me and said, "There are men with guns at your house looking for you." And I went to a lawyer's friend's house right around the corner, and we called every conceivable law enforcement agency, and they all denied it. What's worse than men with guns that are police looking for you? Oh, men with guns that say they're police looking for you. I left town that night. They'd gone for almost another year up in the mountains, where my parents had retired. But I was in a nice place off the grid, so to speak. And I said, I'm being underused. I want to go back to South Carolina if I can find a big old house to live in for free. Drove right to it, decided this is where I'm supposed to be, because I had decided earlier that my revolutionary fervor that was peaked certainly by the 1968 Democratic Convention really turned a corner for me. I could see that this is not what I learned about America. And I had this vision of growing up and becoming a diplomat, maybe even an attorney and a diplomat, and serving foreign policy, because that was the track I'd been on with my father. And the more I learned about American foreign policy, the more or less I could not defend that. And so I was pretty well full-blown revolutionary by the time I landed back in South Carolina, because I'd already had the 2 years on the ground with the Southern Student Organizing Committee, getting in on the tail end of the civil rights movement, being beaten up by the police, just for doing that which it is that they profess to believe in. And so the opportunity to have a Supreme Court case where the minority opinion was Thurgood Marshall and Justice Brennan is something that I hold dear. And shortly thereafter, I'm working. I was a hippie then. I don't know if you knew that, but I was a young hippie, and then I was working in a collective of woodworkers, and went to start a bank account and looked up this woman I'd heard about called Modjeska Simkins, probably the tail end of 74. And she was working at a brick building that I do believe has been torn down now across the street from Allen University. That was a Victory Savings Bank branch. And that was where she held court. And I enjoyed talking with her and understood pretty quickly kindred spirits. And she became, well, let me just say this. The development of the grassroots organizing workshop started as a weekly meeting, as a house meeting, moving it around to people's houses. And these people are people that came out of the Vietnam War, came out of the civil rights movement, that knew the battle wasn't finished, that knew the things that we had been fighting against were still prevalent, wearing different masks and waiting for their time to come back. And so in 77, I had started a hunt for a building that we could use to institutionalize the movement. You got to have a phone call, an address, and things like that to actually build a movement. And finally found an old building that was 5,000 square feet. Wasn't built well in the 30s when it was built, and you could see it was 2 stories, but you could see the sunlight from the ground floor. And the fellow that owned it let us be there. We were there for a number of years for free, doing rehab on it. It went up to 200 a month, and then when he passed away, his family went up to 400 a month. We were there for 21, 22 years as the grassroots organizing workshop, and lost the building. It was and it was sold out from under no notice. But by 76, 77, 78, Modjeska is coming to visit us. I'm going to her house with regularity. And the reason that I became Modjeska's, I like to say left-hand person instead of right-hand person, is that she'd been iced from the polite community. She was iced for that reason that I was being iced. And so we were kindred spirits, quite frankly. And that had both the same perspectives that she had learned from Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois. I've mentioned numerous times during this session that her mother was a founding member of the Niagara movement with Du Bois in 2005. And that was at a time when the civil rights movement wanted more than the right to vote. They wanted healthcare, they wanted to end police brutality, they wanted to stop colonialism. And so that Modjeska was still in that mode. And in the 70s, Grow was carrying forth some of the larger perspectives of those. Modjeska marched with us, and we raised hell. The university had Cougarans during the anti-apartheid movement when we were trying to stop U.S. support of South Africa. And that we picketed a bank, Wells Fargo, I think, on the corner downtown, and she would come out. Kevin Gray, the recently departed comrade, was there. And that we did things like that with her, but she also was active in movement. I did the same thing that we're trying to get everyone here to do, is connect the dots. And if you do, you'll find out that your oppression is caused probably pretty much by the same thing that her oppression is caused by, that gets him too. And when you lift that lid, you understand that you don't pick your allies. The enemy of your enemy is your ally. I don't have to like you if we're going the same way. That was one of Modjeska's precepts, that if you're going my way, I'll work with you. And that got her in a lot of trouble, because some of the people that were going her way were communists and socialists and activists. And that got her iced from the NAACP state conference that she was a founder of in 1939. Her mother founded the Columbia branch, is one of the first branches. Charleston and Columbia were founded in 1917. And so this is something that her family had invested a lot of time in building. And in 1939, she was left, 1959, or was it 57? She was left off of the ballot for offices to be elected for a state conference. So this building that we got became quite a hub of radical activity, not just in South Carolina. We were involved in things that went literally global. We followed kind of in the footprints of the anti-Vietnam GI War movement, which was started at Fort Jackson. I was involved in that in 68 and 69. I was banned from the fort. Man came to see me with a little green card that said U.S. government on the side of it, knocked on my door, and he read a proclamation. Know ye by all men's presence that the commanding general of Fort Jackson has found you inimical to the conduct and morale of his troops, and you are hereby banned from the fort. Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. And we were helping people escape to Canada, helping them file CO papers, and making friends and enemies at the same time. One of the people that was an enemy was a sergeant, a military policeman at Fort Jackson, who then became a sled agent and was personally assigned to me for a number of years as my above ground agent, that I could peek out the window and there he was. Or I would have somebody come visit me from far away, people from Rolling Stone or somewhere like that. And the highway patrol would come and stop us. It was a routine license check, everybody out of the car. And Ron Cook, my sled agent, would be 20 feet behind him, grinning, leaning against his car. So we were very well protected at the time. And the work that we did at the Grow Building was predicated on the fact that the revolution will not be grant funded. how are you going to keep this movement against predatory capitalism alive when you don't have any source of capital from the trickle down theory of the liberals that made it off of predatory capitalism? That's where the big money comes from. And so there's this inherent problem in relying on grant money. And Grove did not want to have grant money, did not take grant money. I think we had one grant I'll speak of in a little while, but that we started a cafe to get the thing going. And the cafe, Grow Cafe, was a legend in its own mind, in its own time. And it was a very popular place that it was good for going to the other side and doing things. If you were the editor of the state paper or the mayor of Columbia, you would go there so you would be seen there so people would know you were cool. So we were a very cool place. And it was I've been described as like a scene out of Star Trek, the bar scenes in Star Trek where there's all these different creatures there. Very much like that. You'd have people that were mill hands next to the people that were gay, next to the people that were hippies, next to people that were long-haired construction workers working at the nuclear reactor. And it was an interesting place. We had a sign that said, "This is not a bar, it's a lesson." And upstairs there were, where there had been apartments, there were 10 apartments. We fixed those up for offices. And we had offices upstairs, and a number of different groups had worked there. And we had started our print shop in 1981. And by 78, we had the cafe going, and the cafe had as many as 6 or 7 people that were working there, but they lived together in a big house in Olympia. And it was that time of that wasn't that expensive to live. I mean, $50 for a whole house was about what you paid in Olympia then. And that in 78, Jimmy Carter becomes president. And I get called down. I'm upstairs in the office, and I get called down saying that there's some wild-eyed, long-haired guy in the supply room that wants to talk to you. He's got money. And it turned out that it was a Vietnam vet who was in charge of the South Carolina Volunteers in Service to America. And VISTA was referred to at the time as the Domestic Peace Corps. And Carter had put anti-war Vietnam vets in charge of both VISTA and the Peace Corps. And John Lewis, who went on to become a congressman, was in charge of VISTA. I had numerous meetings with Lewis. We had one historic meeting at Penn Center with John Lewis. But the thing was is that we had, during the 4 years of the Carter administration, as many as 14 VISTA volunteers. We were very popular with VISTA. VISTA people wanted to come work for us because it was what democracy should look like. The government was paying salaries, minimum wage salaries, to people that were working in this building to try and find the cause of poverty, to try and find the cause of racism, to try and find the cause of war. And they funded our staff that had an office in Barnwell, South Carolina, for nearly a year before the largest anti-nuclear demonstration the South's ever seen in 1978 in Barnwell, South Carolina, with 271 people arrested blocking the entrance to the bomb plant. So that was really an interesting time, and we had probably about $500,000 in 4 years coming in that paid the salaries for the minimum wage people that were working for us. So that was what we considered to be a good investment. As we moved forward in time, let's see what happens then. In 1979, there was the massacre in Greensboro of they were a Communist Workers' Party. They were communists. They were open communists. The reason they were killed was that they had been very successful in organizing white rednecks in the textile mills. Open communists being elected to be presidents of local unions and large textile mills in South Carolina freaked the man out. And by then, we had been already on the list of their traveler who would go around and have meetings and educational meetings about socialism and Marxism with anybody that would bother to listen. And Grow had a study group on a monthly basis with them. And they weren't from around here, so to speak. The people that were the ones that were killed, there were 5 people killed. There was a young woman of color from South Carolina. And the rest of the people were MDs, PhDs, ministers, very capable and competent people that had quit their real jobs and started working in textile mills to do organizing. The level of commitment and intelligence of that group was just staggering. One woman that I met I met her in a working in a textile mill, Roz Pellis from Greensboro. I didn't know she was a lawyer, and she ended up being the national director of the Civil Rights Division of the FL-CIO for many years. And so this was something that I want to share with people to understand that there are people like me, better than me, smarter than me, more disciplined than me, all over the place. And this was like seeing things raise their head and get whacked down, but we're out there and there's a lot of us and we just got to get organized. That's what we're trying to do with Modjeska School, is to give a sense of safety and feeling and believing and articulating that which it is that you believe in. And so the Greensboro massacre,
Yeah,
we don't know what it is.
no, it's gonna feel dumb, but just talking to that, it's not gonna go.
I don't feel dumb. Okay, Becky, is that better? Have talking into this thing, can you hear me better?
Yeah.
Becky's not responding, so I don't guess she can hear me.
No, it's not real strong. You keep fading in and out. I know you're working on it, but
Well, I mean, is it bad enough that we need to stop and do something?
well, that's what Chris is trying to do. Yeah, it is bad enough to, yeah, we can't hear
Even when
you.
I speak up really loudly?
Yeah, it's a sound system problem, Chris has said. It's not about your microphone. So we're gonna try to unplug the sound system that he's using and see if that microphone works better. Sorry, everybody.
The best place. Yeah, let's drag in.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Is that better, Becky? I can't hear you,
Yes,
Becky.
yes,
Yeah.
yes,
Okay.
that's better.
Thank you. Well, we had dead people in Greensboro last time I looked. One of the things that happened after that killing was a trial. It was I'm going to make share the link of the Point of View educational TV special that was made about the Greensboro massacre that we normally have as part of our class, and I don't believe we've sent it to you this year. The killings were televised on the news, and the Klan, you saw the Klan and Nazis working together, pull up, cigarettes hanging out of their mouth, casually open the trunk of the car, pass out guns and point at people and kill them. Lewis Pitts, who you had the occasion of meeting, who did the class on the rise of corporations, was their attorney. Not the Klan and Nazis, but the communists. And Lewis is somebody that from South Carolina that I knew before he moved up to North Carolina. And in the discovery in a civil trial following the charges against the Klan and Nazis for murder, they were found not guilty in a state trial in North Carolina. And it was quite a shock. And that the Klan and Nazis in full regalia did press conference shortly thereafter, a few days after they won the case. That case was a year after the murders. They did a press conference saying it was a great day for the white race and all of right-thinking white people should move to the Carolinas. And so we put on a press conference at the Strom Thurmond Federal Building, where by that time I knew that the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms agent that had penetrated the Klan and Nazis that was involved in that, the ATF had an office in the Thurmond Building, and I pointed at the Thurmond Building. We're standing outside with a bunch of people that some of you would know. I know Darby was there, and we had a bunch of ministers, a very humane and civil crowd, calling on an investigation of federal charges against the Klan and Nazis, and to look into the fact that we know, because we've got the discovery, that the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Division gave the photographs of the people they wanted killed to the Klan and Nazi. And they killed 5 people they had pictures of. It was a government hit squad. And most folks don't know about that. It's not something that we read about in our history books. So that was followed by another one of those phone calls. I've gotten a couple from somebody at the state newspaper. One of my comments on the indictment. I said, what indictment? They said, well, you were indicted by a federal grand jury today for felonious possession of a handgun. And it turned out that the ATF people, because I had spent all of that time with my good friend who was a SLED agent, were very aware of the fact that I had a handgun on my bedside table. That I had been convicted of spray painting Hell No, We Won't Go on the draft board wall in 1970. And so we're now in 1982, I think, 12 years later. And that I didn't know, nor did any of the police know that the federal law doesn't prohibit just felons from having a handgun. It's length of sentence. If you're sentenced to a crime that's punishable by more than a year in jail, you cannot have a gun. I spent 2 years for a misdemeanor. And so I was a very kind of passive violation of the law. And I was charged and was turned over to the new U.S. attorney, a young guy named Henry McMaster. This is 1982, probably. And that we were in front of the federal judge, who was Strom Thurmond's law partner, who had issued a prohibition against our protest at the Savannah River plant like 2 years earlier. Headlines, federal judge bans protest, and that we had him overturned quickly. But I already had established a fairly rocky relationship with federal judge, and he was sitting on my case, and that I had this meeting with Henry that I want you to, this is important that you know that I know Henry McMaster and a lot of other people, and we need to have that type of institutional memory carried forward and shared. But Henry's not real bright. And Henry's brother was a drug dealer at the university. Henry knew that. He was in a fraternity there, and I've got information that is personal and impeachable of his character. But I actually thought Henry was a pretty nice guy. He was friendly to me. And during the time he came in and stopped the hearing, called me out to his office. This is 82, after I've been charged with a felony for having committed a misdemeanor 10 years earlier, 12 years earlier. And Henry offered me probation if I pled guilty. I said, Henry, I'm not pleading guilty to a felony. And we talked for a while. And one of the things I distinctly remember him saying is, I've never met a vegetarian. What's that like? And so I had to tell Henry what it was like to be a vegetarian. And he later was quoted in the newspaper as saying that this fellow wouldn't hurt anybody. He couldn't even hurt an animal. So like I said, Henry's not the sharpest knife in the drawer. But we continued to talk, and I pointed out to Mr. McMaster that I was the only intervener in the licensing of the nuclear reactor that was being built 3.5 miles from the house I lived in, out by Peak, South Carolina, in 1978 through 1981. It took them 5 years to get it operating. It was the last reactor built in America, and it would have been the only reactor ever built in America without public hearings. And it was because South Carolina, the DHEC said, well, that's a power company. We trust them. And so I filed to intervene, and I got status because I was in the evacuation zone. And so for 5 years, I was in Federal Nuclear Regulatory Commission court in Columbia. And I had subpoena power. I had federal subpoena power, and subpoenaed all the directors of the state agencies that were supposed to have a role in the evacuation plan. And they didn't even know about it. So we just really took apart their plan, made them do things like rebuild stuff that cost millions and millions of dollars. And that the final 3-judge hearing for the operating license was scheduled in courtroom A in the courtrooms there at the Strom Thurmond complex on a certain date at a certain time. Judge Simon set my trial for the felony gun charge, courtroom B, the same day and the same time, thinking that that would like besmirch my character to be tried, in 2 courtrooms at the same time. And I told Henry, I said, I'm not coming to your trial. You're going to have to send the marshals in to drag me out of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission hearing. And you know what, Henry? It's going to look like you're covering up for the power company. And Henry said, well, I guess the only thing we can do is dismiss the charges. I said, Henry, I think that would be a a smart career move. And so he did, and the judge went berserk and said that no red-blooded American could support me and blah, blah, blah. So we travel on, but I do want to mention that because Henry was certainly involved in many other failed things, but like the other nuclear reactor that I'll speak to in a minute when we get up to that date. But the 1983, well, 81, we started the print shop, and that was one of the things that I really wanted to do, and I've got bent fingers and from the printing press, and a lot of the posters you see here, not a lot of them, some of them we printed. We became an IWW, Industrial Workers of the World Labor Union in 1981. And part of that was because the AFL-CIO wouldn't take worker-run, worker-owned organizations, to which I had this interesting conversation with this AFL-CIO organizer and said, wait a minute, you mean that your vision for the future is that you've always got to have a boss? And he went away scratching his head about that. They do take nonprofits now. The Progressive Network has been a union paid member of the National Writers Union, which is a subset of the United Auto Workers for probably since the mid-90s. But we were IWW, which was a socialist union that we've talked about in the past. And we're printing, this is before Al Gore discovered the internet. This is when phones had wires that ran to the wall. And computers, if they existed, they were probably belonged to the defense agency. And so we printed newsletters for all of the nonprofits and all the unions. And so we were supporting our social justice habit the old-fashioned way by earning the money to pay ourselves with. And so we did that. And I think one of the stellar things that was accomplished there was, what year was that? Now, about 1988. I know that Reagan was president. I can tell time frames now by thinking who was president, but it was a time when we were trying to destabilize the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua because they were trying to overthrow the dictator that we had put in several decades before that, which is if you wonder how and why we're having all these migration problems, if you lift the lid a little bit and find out that we screwed up their economy by supporting brutal dictators in just about all of those countries, going all the way back to the Monroe and the Monroe Doctrine, and we had Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders, and so we had the Contras with Reagan, and so the state of South Carolina under who was the governor? I thought, oh, Carroll Campbell. Carroll Campbell was the governor, and we put up a sign. Grow got permission to put a sign up on the lawn of the State House at a time when nonprofits, 501c3s, could put signs up on the State House. And we went to put our sign up, and they said they changed the law. They changed the rules. I said, when? They said, this morning. I said, oh, really? And our sign said, remember Vietnam, keep South Carolina National Guard out of Central America. Henry McMaster's just issued an order to send our National Guard to the border of Texas.
Yes.
The border with Mexico. History is repeating itself, folks.
Mm-hmm.
And so they wouldn't let us put the sign up, and we started asking questions, and Bob Gild, one of our lawyer friends, started taking depositions. The Budget and Control Board was I think it was 8 people and the governor that basically ran the state at the time, and that there were, I think, a minority of them, 3 or 4 of them were Democrats. And so he had the Budget Control Board people saying, the Democrats were saying, oh yeah, the governor was incensed about it. He blames Bursey for his brother's death in Vietnam. And that all of the other people, including the governor, said, oh, no. It was just a matter of safety. The sign could fall over on somebody, crush a child, or you could be driving down Assembly Street and see the sign and freak out and crash. Right. And so we sued. It's called a 1981 action, 1984, 1983, it's an action where a government official uses their official position to do something that is illegal. So that's what we charged Carroll Campbell, the governor, with, and we subpoenaed the governor. He tried to get out of it. We made a sitting governor come to a federal hearing. And the governor lied through his teeth. He said he didn't know about our sign and blah, 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 woof, woof. And I thought for sure this charming lad was going to sway the jury. And he got up and left. And the judge said, Judge Karen Henderson, a woman federal judge, again in the Strom Thurmond courthouse, said, I've been remiss at this point if I did not issue a directed verdict of guilty. The parties have until 10 o'clock in the morning to have a settlement on my desk. And they came and gave us a check for $50,000. And we bought our first brand new 2-color printing press. And we named it the Carroll Campbell Memorial Freedom of Speech Press. And we proceeded to print propaganda for years and years and years. That press finally died when we couldn't get it worked on. After Grow closed, we took it to the barn that we built to live in, that Becci and I are still living in. And it had a computer on it, which is a sad thing. And we couldn't get it worked on. And I called Japan, where the press was made, when I couldn't find anybody in America to work on it. And the only word I understood in Japanese was obsolete. And so that press now resides in a small village in India with a love note in it and all the handbooks and stuff, with people that probably are smarter than I am that needed it more desperately and took the computer off of it. Wow. But that's an endearing story, but also that gave rise to the case called Grow versus Campbell, wherein we had a power to make a settlement with the state government, where we changed the way that they allow people to use their own state property. And so now, and since then, you don't ask for permission to be on the State House ground. You make a reservation if you have more than 200 people or need sound equipment or something like that. And so it was something that we relied on. The Edwards versus SC lawsuit in 1961, when they arrested 185 young Black people on the State House ground for praying, and that they won that in a Supreme Court case. We relied on that. And then when Nikki Haley was governor, and she had the Occupy people that were like occupying the State House grounds, she had them arrested. And they used the Grow case that used the Edwards VSC case. That's that type of linear history that you can look up in law books if you know where to look. We citizens need to be able to at least access the linear history of the people who are fighting the same struggles we're fighting. Becci, does that sound better? Is she making hand signals?
Yes, it sounds better.
She doesn't understand, I can't see her. And Becci, if you've got something to say, or I forget to say something, I want you just to chime in there, because we're up to 1983 and I'm going to start speeding it up here. I had occasion after the Greensboro massacre and working with those people. And I was also at the same time had relationships, and one of my good friends who lived with me spent time at Wounded Knee during the occupation out there. And so I got plugged into the American Indian movement and had occasion to go to Geneva to the second decennial World Conference on Racism in 1983. And I had the American Indian, the American Indian movement had a status as a non-governmental organization at the United Nations, where they had observer status, and they could like interface and put things on the table. And part of it was putting this systemic racism in America on the table. And I'm there, and there's like a couple thousand delegates from all over the world. And there were 3 countries that boycotted it. Guess which 3 countries? Anybody? Let me guess this.
The US.
Huh?
United Kingdom, Britain, and France.
Okay. How about South Africa, Israel, and the United States?
Okay.
The conference in 1973, at the first conference, had declared Zionism a form of racism. That Zionism was not a political form, it was a form predicated on various ethnicity and religion, and that was a form of racism if you used it to oppress people. And so, being good repressors, and South Africa still had apartheid, America still has Jim Crow, the only 3 countries that weren't represented were the ones that were the obvious people that needed to be there. And I was the only white male American at a conference on racism, a world conference on racism, and felt, again, that terrible sense of responsibility that my mother raised me well to meet. And it was impactful.
What was this year?
83,
Thank you.
and I had occasion to send my first telex to the Secretary of State decrying her rudeness and not being represented. And we started after that looking at the things that were happening in Central America. We printed a lot of stuff about the Pledge of Resistance. I don't see one of our posters on the wall here, but the Pledge of Resistance was something that a lot of people took, that if the United States did cross a red line, which would be invading Nicaragua, people would then go to their congressman's office and stay there until they call the troops back. We had like thousands of people around the country and hundreds in South Carolina signed up on notice to go. And that the work that we did there followed up on the work where we had the sign that was earlier about that. And 1983. I'm going to move right on to 1990 when we started working on a newspaper. We had the print shop. The print shop had done its own publications. The print shop's called Harbinger Publications. The print shop still exists. Becci and I still turn out work. We don't own the printing press now, but we're quite adept at being able to do the front work. And Becci is an incredibly good editor, and she does typesetting and composition, which is evidence in her publications that all of you have seen. And so there's never been a revolutionary that didn't want a printing press. And then to be able to have a newspaper at a time before the internet was something that also leveraged our reach in the state. And I wanted to see the paper start to be able to further the effort to build a progressive movement in South Carolina. And so in 1990, we started talking about it. And I had at that point developed some good friends with the Rolling Stone newspaper in New York. And the design person that designed the Rolling Stone came down and spent time with us at this long meeting with the people that were working on it at the time, that to name the thing, name the paper. And at some point late in the night when we'd been arguing back and forth, somebody said, "What's the point?" And Hans Thiemse, who was the guy that came down, he said, "That's it. That's it." And the paper became known as The Point. And then not long after that, we reshaped the paper as it failed miserably before it really got started trying to be a weekly. And there was an initial concept that it would be for profit. And that was just two bad ideas on top of each other. And so when that wore out, we decided to go to a monthly nonprofit. And it was at that point that this young woman who had been working at the Bar Association and their communications department had written a story about South Carolina being the only state in the nation that didn't allow anonymous testing for AIDS. And if there's a way to not stop an epidemic, that would be it, to have no anonymous testing, because if you tested positive, it was the law. They called your school, they called your church, they called your family, they called your friends, and told them that you'd stay away from it. And so obviously no one was getting tested. And the Bar Association wouldn't run the story because at the same time, the Christian Coalition was taking over the state of South Carolina. And that this was 91. I think the story was written 94. The Christian Coalition, the candidates endorsed by the Christian Coalition took the House, the Senate, and the governor's office. So we had a what would you call that? A religious coup? That's not even religious, a cult. Yes, a cult took over the state. But Becci stayed. Becci checked in and became the editor. And kind of like Hotel California, you can check in, but you can never leave when you're doing something that's meaningful and rewarding. But she still is angry at me many years later for letting The Point die, which was her love. And mine too. I would rather be an investigative reporter than trying to organize the state of South Carolina. But I couldn't keep the balls in the air at the same time of running this monthly newspaper that we were printing between 17,000 and 35,000 copies a month and distributing them, sometimes by driving ourselves to Charleston and Greenville, and then UPSing stuff all over the place. And we had no grant money to do that. That was all labors of love, and we had a little bit of advertising, and that and 2000, late 2000, we did our last issue, I think it was 2001. And the picture that Becky sent out on the notice of this class of Strom Thurmond writing the bomb down or the bomb plant below it, I hope everyone saw that. That is an example of Horde Stubblefield's artwork. And Horde graduated from Clemson when it was a military school, I think in the 30s, and went off to New York, became a famous cartoonist, working for national publications, which maybe Becky remembers the name of one of them. Do you, Becky? That Horde worked for?
No, he was working for all of the mainstream magazines doing, illustrations for things that you would know,
But
publications
Yeah,
like the New Yorker. It might have not have been the New Yorker, but I'm just saying that kind of caliber. Yeah.
yeah, we were incredibly lucky to have him, and we have someday we'll have all those things scanned. We were, how many issues, Becky? 102?
Yeah, it was right at 100.
Yeah. And so that just the artwork on the covers is worth memorializing. But I continue to this day to be looking at a subject that I need to find information on South Carolina and find a story I wrote many years ago. And so it was really good work that needs to be done again, but the days of newspapers, you may have noticed, are difficult.
Brett, can I just
Yeah.
add something about it? It was really good work, and we operated on a shoestring budget as we're used to doing, but it was ridiculous. But we were just barely covering printing costs, and thanks to the volunteer effort of the people that donated their time and talent to the thing to write really good investigative pieces that sometimes they couldn't place somewhere else, or they were so mangled and edited and whatever, that we would, for instance, we were one of the first people in South Carolina to do something on Strom Thurmond's Black Daughter that everybody knew about here in South Carolina, but everybody was too polite to talk about here. So a national publication ran something, and we ran an excerpt of it, a little bit nervous about it, but it's those kind of things. But the thing that I other than the artwork, which Horde was, I still want to do a showing of his political cartoons. They were just really wonderful. And he always did our covers. And so it had a kind of vintage flavor that I thought really made the print copies, which you can't really appreciate on the online archives, which started in '96. We were, if not the first, one of the first papers to go online. And thanks to Steve Haight, who is on the call right now, he started archiving our stuff online, which is a real service. But one of the things, for an example of the things that we did a piece on the Department of Health and Environmental Control, which was DHEC. And every story that we did, it seemed like you could trace it back to DHEC. That all the environmental pollution, all the, dirty lobbyists, all the really gross things that happen behind closed doors, a lot of it you could trace back to DHEC, and they had so much power. And so we did a feature along, spread on this, and they had a mandate to, which was part of the problem, which was their thing was to protect the environment and to promote business. And we claimed, and it is true, that you can't do both. And so they were always, the health of the people and the environment was always second fiddle to corporate interests. And so we thought the whole thing needed to be restructured. We did this long thing, and it was great. And we did a campaign with the network at the same time to kind of push this notion about restructuring and reformulating what DHEC's mission was, which would affect a lot of people. But the thing kind of, as it does, without kind of funding and all that, it kind of met its timely death. But a few years later, the state newspaper did the same story as I did, interviewing the same people. I mean, it looked like the same spread. I'm not even kidding you. And they won these national awards for the same thing. And I remember calling Bill Rogers was my mentor. He in college, and he at that time was heading up the Press Association in South Carolina. He just retired. A wonderful guy. And I said, they robbed me, that was my award. And he said, yep, you're right. So we did really good work is my point. And we didn't get the kind of recognition that we deserved, I don't think, but it was a lot of fun. And yeah, I'm mad that we still don't have it.
Okay.
Thank you, Becky. So the point is going to be scanned by the university and will be available soon, someday, maybe within the year. We did just find, I don't, Becky, I don't know if Cecil Whitby told you that he found a friend that had a full copy of Point. And if it's a full copy, it's even some that we don't have. And so that's something I'm looking forward to, because it was really, really great artwork and good stories. I'm going to speed it up here and talk about the time when right before the Christian Coalition took over in '94, the election in '92 saw Joe Neal and Gilda Cobb Hunter winning elections. And Joe and Gilda were the first real progressive legislators in South Carolina. I had known progressive legislators in North Carolina and Georgia in the '60s. And so there's something to be learned there about the systemic nature of oppression in South Carolina. There are many, many places we can see that reflected, and this is certainly one of them. But we were working with Joe on environmental issues right when he got elected, because there's a Superfund site directly across the street from the Westinghouse nuclear fuels plant out on Bluff Road and Lower Richland. And Joe was born in Lower Richland, raised in Lower Richland. His father was a very well-known minister down there. And this is on land that they'd had in their family for generations. And so that Lower Richland area is one of the largest undeveloped pieces of land adjacent to a state capital on the East Coast. And it's the largest piece of land that is in Black hands. And so there's been a lot of effort to develop that and push back and forth and how that gets done. But we started working with Joe on environmental issues and met Gilda through that. And they were involved in the discussions after the Christian Coalition in '94 took over. We had a meeting and they were involved in that. And I wrote a grant. And we got, I think it was $20,000, it might have been $25,000 from an environmental foundation that knew of our work on the environmental side, that we told we can't win an environmental fight without bringing other people in that understand the implications of it. And so we got a grant to start a statewide progressive network. And that was in '95, and we worked on that for the better part of a year and had our founding conference at Penn Center in 1996. And there was another one of those name games. One of the first things we did at Penn Center, and spent a long time doing it, was try and decide what we're going to name this statewide progressive network. You can see the outcome. Well, that was it. So we were the South Carolina Progressive Network and have been for 27 years now. That first meeting, it was hard. It was contentious. Becky wrote a story about that was called Casting the Net. Becky, could you sum that up for us? It wasn't easy, was it?
No, the first conference was, wow, it was really intense because we did have so many different constituents at the table. And so it was one of our, Brett's talked about it, but it really was fundamental to our founding, which was how widely are you going to do it? Are you going to risk alienating potential members, both organizationally and individually, by including people that are working for abortion access or the very quite unpopular labor unions in South Carolina, et cetera. And we, do we include gay people? We had a gay contingent there. And so, I mean, you have to also remember these were different times. So it wasn't as, we weren't as inclusive as we at least pretend to be now. It seems like we're retreating again, but it seems like back then it was really serious consideration about how to do it. The guy that came down to kind of support us had been from Missouri Provo, had understood what it meant to make a statewide coalition. And they used a model that it's a different universe up there. They were relying on the support of unions. So they had a very narrow base and easy to organize, easy to fundraise, easy to identify. And we decided to take the risk, even against his advice, frankly, to open it up to anybody that would support our mission. And you might have read the mission, but it's all of the things that we all stand for at this time so proudly. but it was a risk back then. And I'm really, really pleased that we did, because we took the risk on opening it to anybody. And that inclusivity has really served us well over the years, because over time, those relationships that we built on trust, they knew we had their backs and vice versa. So that it was unlike anything else in South Carolina, and still is. So I'm just really proud that at the beginning, we made the difficult decision to be as inclusive as possible and to open the doors as widely as we could.
Thank you, Becky. I'm having a flashback to 1976, 78, actually. It's coming in now. And it was when we started the Natural Guard Fund as our 501c3 sponsor. So Grow didn't have any type of federal status. And so we had another corporation, the Natural Guard Fund, that was environmentally oriented. That's natural.
I heard you.
And it was confusing because the Natural Guard Fund's address was 18 Bluff Road, and the National Guard's address was 1800 Bluff Road. And we got calls from guys wanting to report to duty. And I said, no, you don't have to come in today. We've called the war off. So we got a post office box after that. But the Natural Guard Fund went international. And the work that we did, simply by focusing on America's bomb plant so effectively and so powerfully and so early in the game, that poster that you see there with the nuclear specter on it was drawn by the same comrade and friend and who recently passed that did the Grow Tree, a fantastic artist. And that picture I've seen in several countries in Europe when I went over there while we were doing the anti-nuclear stuff. Saw it in Bonn and in Amsterdam. I have friends that saw it in Japan. And we had international support and involvement in the anti-nuclear movement because most of the technology was being pushed and the money's coming from the United States. And that we put together a protest series that had a national meeting in St. Louis that called for a protest of the nuclear fuel cycle. And that starts with the uranium mining. I spent time with the Navajos in Grants, New Mexico, where the Sacred Mountain is. And that there was the mining and then the production of the material that runs the reactors and the production of the material that makes the bombs, and then the nuclear reactors. We had protests, civil disobedience all over America at the nuclear reactors. And Lewis Pitts was on the team, traveling around, helping people get into and out of trouble. And this was good trouble. This is the type of stuff that John Lewis talked about. And Lewis and Danny Sheehan of the Christic Institute that was the legal team that handled the Karen Silkwood case, that a movie was made out of that with Cher about the nuclear worker that was killed for blowing the whistle. And so this was big. It was international. It was powerful. And that the bottom line here is that after the No Newts concert at Madison Square Gardens, which was the culmination of it, I was involved in setting that up marginally. I got invited to the initial meeting, and Jackson Browne played. That's a quote from Jackson Browne on that poster there. Some of them were angry and some of them were confused at the way that the men learned to forge her beauty into power. And that he did 2 concerts at the township for us leading up to a big protest that sold out back-to-back shows at the township for the first time that they could remember. And then he played at the rally at Barnwell that we didn't tell anybody he was coming. And I have people still mad at me 30-something years later because they left before Jackson got on the stage, because we didn't want it written up as a pop festival. And it was the height of his career. If people had known, we would have had 20,000 people instead of 5,000. But there were a lot of good people pulling on the same end of the rope to make all of this happen, which resulted in the nuclear reactor outside of Columbia being the last reactor built for more than 20-something years, until the $9 billion hole in the ground outside of Columbia now. That we can take some credit for at least unplugging the nuclear power cycle for so long. And the thing is that the nuclear reactor stuff is so much like all the other fights that I've been into. And it's not necessarily the nuclear reactor. It's not necessarily the radiation. It's the money. See, power company gets 10% or whatever percentage the Public Service Commission sets. The Public Service Commission is appointed by the legislature. All legislators get to be on the Public Service Commission, and they get retainers. And then the legislators that practice in front of the Public Service Commission get retainers from the power company. And it's just a big old funding trough. And so if you get a percentage of how much you spend to make electricity, what are you going to do? You're going to build the most expensive damn thing to make electricity you can get your hands on. And you're going to centralize it so you own it. And you're going to lose about a third to half of it, sending it out on these long wires like we're catching California on fire, as opposed to the sun, which is cranking out more power than we could use on a daily basis, but Exxon can't get a lease on it. And so we're stuck with this silliness of having to pay a utility bill for something they told us was going to be so cheap to meter. So cheap, you wouldn't have to meter it. They lied to you. But the thing is that I'm going to connect some dots before we get further into the progressive network about that money trail. And part of what we're trying to do with the Modjeska School is letting people see and understand who made the decisions that affect our lives, when did they make them, what were the circumstances around making them, and what are the implications today. I mean, some of the implications are not having healthcare like the rest of the world does, not having sick leave like the rest of the world does, not having maternity care like the rest of the world does, because we have turned over the healthcare industry to the lobbyists that work for the AMA. And I have a number of MD friends that have given up. I mean, they can't practice anymore. They've got to either work in a doc in a box, because most of the people they need are insurance workers. And that is just reflective of the type of thing that's happening in every branch of business in America, where the corporations have replaced any type of leadership that could have a moral effect on the outcome. Corporations do not have morals. And so as we've turned all our big corporations, whether it's steel making or auto making, into giant corporations that are run by a board of directors whose primary responsibility, according to law, is the shareholders. If you do something that's against the interest of the shareholders of a corporation, you sit on the board of, you can go to jail. The SEC can put you in jail for not following that obligation. So we've created this master that's clearly out of control. So that's just a little footnote, folks.
Thank you.
We'll press on into the work that we did with Joe and Gilda and getting the progressive network off the ground. First thing we looked at was money in politics. South Carolina was the only state in the nation in 1990s, early 90s, and I think 96 is when we started, and in 98 we started working on money in politics at a time when we were the only state that didn't have electronic filing, where legislators and people run for office had to go on to a website, put that stuff in, and then it was publicly shared. There was no transparency in the money. You had to go to the Ethics Commission, sign in, ask for them to give you a file that they then notify the person whose file you pulled that you pulled their file. And you could take a pencil and a piece of paper and write notes. And that there was a good person running it, Gary Bowers or Baum, at the time, who told me that, Brett, we're not cops, we're just file clerks. We just put stuff in a drawer. We don't initiate complaints. Somebody outside has to complain. And so that was the Ethics Commission that we encountered. Joe wrote and Gilda co-sponsored a bill to require electronic filing and public access. And we introduced that in 97, and it didn't go anywhere. That year we got a grant of $10,000 to be able to make some copies. And I called Gary at the Election Commission and said, hey, we want to get some copies. And he said, what do you want? I said, everything. And we rented 2 copy machines and paid students and senior citizens for 600 hours of copying services that we then sent boxes and boxes and boxes of stuff to the National Institute of Money and State Politics in Helena, Montana, of all places, that they had a grant from the Ford Foundation to key in, because we were the last place not doing it. And the legislature said, we simply can't afford that. We did it for $10,000, embarrassed the hell out of them. Next year they found the money. And they have created, I encourage you to go to the State Election Ethics Commission's website and try and look up somebody. It is the worst designed website, maybe not by accident, that you could encounter, but I would suggest you're much better off going to followthemoney.org, which has the state-based exposure. If you've given money, you're in there. And that what we've been able to do over the years, I'm going to connect some dots again. We've been able to connect the dots between the initiators of something. Now, whether that was the resurgence of the nuclear cycle from the atomic industry and the Edison Institute and all of that, there's a group called the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is a right-wing think tank that cranks out boilerplate legislation that they then shop for the stupidest, corruptest state they can find to introduce this stuff as a model. And that to bring the nuclear industry back online, there needed to be several things happen after that hiatus between 81 and it was, what year was it that they started that reactor out in Jenkinsville again, the second set of reactors. I don't know. It was in the 90s. And so they got permission to build that reactor after the feds changed the law that when I was intervening on the first reactor, you had a period of construction and then you had a period of operating. There were two different licenses. You had to build the damn thing before you got any money for it. And you had to make it safe, pass the audition to get an operating license. So it took years for the companies to begin billing. So in the 90s, right before they started the new reactor out there, they passed a law called the combined licensing. And so you go and you apply and you get your license before you build anything, before you do anything. And then they got the insurance thing reinstituted where if the thing blows up and kills a whole bunch of people and causes $1 billion worth of damage, the power company is not responsible. So that's in place. And the final thing that they needed was a state that they could get to pass a law that allowed the company to begin billing before they begin building. They tried to do it in Florida. I saw this coming because I was already watching the American Legislative Exchange Council. I have seen legislation introduced in the legislature that said your state name goes here. They forgot to put that, South Carolina in there. It's boilerplate stuff. And so the American Legislative Exchange Council has all of these corporations involved, their attorneys and their minions, promoting things that open doors for this. And so I saw this coming in Florida. In Florida, they beat it. It came to South Carolina with a different title. It was called the Baseload Review Act. What the hell is that? I don't know. Well, what that is we're going to push the payment of this thing spread it over a whole bunch of years, so your grandmother doesn't have to pay for this, or your grandchildren. Your grandchildren don't have to pay for this later on. Well, that sounds like a consumer issue. And the guy that it was running the LCI, Labor, Commerce, and Industries Committee in the House, a guy named William Sandefur. I can't say anything nice about Mr. Sandefur, so I'm not going to say anything at all, but he was an ALEC co-chair of a committee for ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. He was the sponsor of the bill. He also was running the committee. I waited for public hearings and they told me they weren't going to have any. They didn't need to have any. There's nothing to compel them to have public hearings. They put the bill on the floor of the House 3 days after it was introduced, and it passed and went to the Senate. And the Senate sponsor, the floor sponsor of the bill in the Senate was Tommy Moore, the Democratic candidate for governor that year. So here's a bill coming out of a Republican committee going to the Senate. It goes to the floor with a voice vote and passes the day it's introduced. 4 days. And the state passed this bill to let the power company start charging us before they build a reactor. The original cost of the Westinghouse reactor, I left out one of the things that needed to be in place before all this would work, was the approval of like a modular reactor. well, we're not going to build different ones. Westinghouse is going to build the same one, and you prove that, and it's done. Kind of like a trailer, you just kind of put it in your place. But it's obviously a very expensive and dangerous proposition. And so the original cost for the whole deal was 9.8 billion. When it crashed, 9 years into building, they'd already spent over they already took $9 billion from us. And the thing's like half finished. And then they started looking into it, saying, oh my goodness, we've got to find the problem here. And I wrote something about look in the mirror. Look in the mirror. And I had the money trail that flowed from the industries to the various committees and subcommittees and politicians, $65,000 to the governor. One of the sleaziest one was the McNair firm, one of the largest law firms in South Carolina, took the boilerplate legislation and tailored it for South Carolina, gave it to them, was paid for doing that. And then the lawyers gave $60-something thousand in donations to the people that paid them to do that. It's a closed loop, folks. It's a closed loop. That's just one example of following the money back to a huge problem that we're sucking wind on. Got all worked up about that. I'm not apologizing. Becci, stop me if I get too crazy here.
Oh, hell.
Uh-huh.
Too late.
Too late. I'm trying to figure out how to turn a page in this thing. I had all this on a piece of paper. I couldn't find. Oh, here we are. We're up to 1996. And a flashback on the National Guard Fund, because when we started the Progressive Network, the National Guard Fund was our C3 sponsor. We didn't get 501c3 status for the network until 98, but that's kind of an inside fact. I just wanted you to know that the National Guard Fund did phenomenal work, and that it still resonates. The first thing we did was that electronic filing thing. We do now have one of those. In 2000, shortly thereafter, we started the Progressive Caucus of the South Carolina Democratic Party. And Gilda Cobb-Hunter and I did that. And I've been a delegate to every state convention since 78, I believe, and had the opportunity to nominate John Roy Harper to run against Don Fowler. Don Fowler, Mr. Democrat. And he was the chair of the party at a time when we were fighting the nuclear dump in Barnwell. And John Roy Harper was the attorney for the NAACP. And he, with no notice, decided to run against Fowler. And it was kind of a Hail Mary pass. We're going to make a point. And I had the nominating speech, which is 5 minutes with 1,000 people in the room. And I had the responsibility and opportunity to tell the group there, I bet each one of you had somebody tell you on your way here, why do you bother? There's really no difference between the parties. And you know what, folks? We're getting ready to prove that, because we just passed a resolution earlier to close the Barnwell nuclear dump. And now we're getting ready to vote for the man whose livelihood depends on keeping the Barnwell nuclear dump alive as his biggest client for Fowler Communications, Don Fowler. And it went to a vote, and Harper got like almost half the votes without any planning. And so this is an inkling that the rank and file of the Democratic Party aren't following the party line. There is no party line that we're welcome to participate in or enforce. They're just doing it because they don't have an option. And so if we can provide a better option, we can control the party. And so with that in mind, many years later, in 2000, we started a Progressive Caucus of the Democratic Party. And that we were quickly able to control the floor of a convention of 1,000 people. You can be out of order by putting something on the floor, like we passed resolutions up from the rank and file of the counties up to the state resolution committee, and it did not make the agenda for the state conference. And that resolution was for the Democratic Party to be foursquare against the 2006 amendment to change the Constitution to make gay marriage unconstitutional. Gay marriage was already illegal. The Republican Party put that on the ballot. Only the legislature can put something on the ballot, the general election ballot. And it was clear that it was done to drive their base to the polls. The Democratic Party was afraid to touch it. And I moved that we put that back on the floor. They found me out of order. And I challenged the chair, and the bylaws allow a challenge of the chair with a second from 25% of the delegates present. And so they put the vote to the floor, and 900 out of 1,000 people stood up. And you should have seen John Land and Jim Clyburn's face and all. And Vince Sheen's daddy got in my face and was screaming at me. He was going to run his son's political career, make him take a statement on that. They are so committed to convincing 4 to 5% of Republicans to change their vote that they're leaving enough people out that if they dealt with the issues of the 400,000 registered Black voters that are staying home, they could change the outcome of elections. They keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. And Marjorie Hammett could tell us what that is. Insanity, Ms. Hammett. And so that group that we started, which I don't know if Becky has the ability to put something up that has that one of the handouts, but we actually were recognized as the caucus of the party. Traditionally, caucuses are an interest group within inside a larger group that defend the interest of that caucus. And that we were able to use the mailing packages, put flyers in them. We were having breakfast before the convention with a couple hundred delegates at the convention for breakfast at 7 o'clock in the morning. We became a real threat and a pain in the ass for them. And that we challenged them on Medicaid expansion. That was 2014. And Vince Sheen had lost, this is a brochure about the Progressive Caucus, clearly claimed by the South Carolina Progressive Network, individual members of the C4. We haven't been doing that. One of the reasons I'm bringing this up is this is something that's in your future, not in mine. I quit. But I want to share with you what I've learned, and that is that there's a tremendous need and desire for this type of leadership, as evidenced by the fact that in 2014, after we embarrassed them horribly on the Medicaid expansion thing because Vince Shaheen wouldn't come out in favor of the Medicaid expansion because he told me, I can't support Obamacare. Again, after 4% of Republican votes, he'd only lost to Nikki Haley in the 2010 election by 49,000 votes. We had 230,000 names of registered voters that had their Medicaid card denied. That's the type of database that we have that we want to share with people that want to do that type of work. And so after that convention in April, the executive committee of the state Democratic Party had a meeting and they wrote bylaws to create caucuses. The caucuses would have their chair appointed by the state party chair. They would have officers from each of the 7 congressional districts involved. They would support the platform, which was no problem. And they would support all of the candidates, which was a problem. See, we support the platform. The candidates don't support the platform. No, we can't do that. So we quit. We said, this is unethical. We quit. And now go to the state Democratic Party now and look up caucuses. We had one that fought for justice and truth in the American way that kicked ass. There's now like a dozen or 15. There was like a rural Black caucus, an urban Black caucus, a farm caucus, and a gay caucus, and a lesbian caucus, and this caucus. And they spend their time fighting with each other because they don't have the unity to have the power to work together. So that's a significant lesson. Those with less power tend to fight amongst themselves. But Dr. Greene, I'm going to hurry up here and see I've got another lesson. The Republican trifecta came into place in 2002. They won the House, the Senate, and the governor's office. They draw the maps for districts that determine who gets elected. And we have amongst the least competitive elections in the nation. And our position is we cannot vote our way out of the problems that the system is designed to perpetuate. And that's hard. That's hard to tell people your vote doesn't count. But I think that we have to be honest with people. That's what the Missing Voter Project has been doing. If you go out and you go to voter registration, people come up and they say, why don't you vote? Well, it doesn't make any difference. We agree with you. The system's rigged. It's crooked. You've got to vote smart. You've got to build a movement that operates around values that we share. And so we've got to build a movement that shares those values in order to have the power to change the inside game. And so that's why we've taken some time and considerable effort to develop what we call an inside-outside strategy, where we are well-versed on the inside. Progressive Network is the only entity I know of in South Carolina, to the left of liberal, or even the Democratic side, that's actually writing laws and having them pass, that's actually picking elections and changing the outcome. In 2016, there were 2 races that we worked, and we're now, when I'm talking about we had a maturation of our policy in terms of electoral politics that we started at Penn Center. We didn't have a C4. There wasn't necessary to have C4s, and that didn't happen until the federal government in 2008. We had a progressive voter coalition, SC Pro Vote. So the individual members belonged to SC Pro Vote. And so we endorsed everybody that agreed with us. And that, the ones that were going to win would win, the ones that were going to lose would lose, and it didn't change anything. So finally we figured out we got to be smart. And so we would pick races where the bit of energy that we had would make a difference. And in 2016, we picked Lee Bright's district, running for Senate in Spartanburg. He was the guy that wanted to keep the Confederate flag up after the Mother Emanuel going. He had a bill to make South Carolina the incandescent light bulb capital of the world because the government's trying to take our incandescent light bulbs away from them. He wanted to go back to the gold standard. And Lee Bright was an embarrassment to the species. And so we had 80-something members or allies in Spartanburg that were going to have Lee Bright for their representative if they didn't do something about it, because there was no Democrat running. And so we talked to the candidates that were running, and Scott Talley had lost his Republican House seat by a Tea Party person who was crazier than he was. And I talked to Scott. We knew people that knew him at Winthrop and Wofford, and he was a lawyer that did the divorce case for somebody I knew. And I interviewed Scott, and I said, Scott, you passed our audition. You're not insane. You're wrong on everything, but you're not insane. And we're going to support you, and we won't tell anybody. He said, well, okay. He got in a runoff and won. He would not have won if it hadn't been for us. We didn't do that to make a big name or anything. We did that to learn how to build the capacity to have the power to punish or reward. The same year, we got behind Senator Mike Fanning. Well, he wasn't a senator then. He was just our friend, Mike Fanning, PhD educator who had quit teaching school and had started a consortium to help the schools in the I-95 corridor to collaborate. And so Mike lives in Fairfield and a tremendous guy. And we started working with him in 2010 when the legislature got the Tax Realignment Commission report that showed where the money was coming from, where the taxes, they wanted to readjust the taxes. And so the legislature wanted to use the found money by finding a whole bunch of exemptions that could be done away with, like the $300 cap on cars and automobiles and airplanes. You buy a Lamborghini, taxes $300. You buy a used Chevy, taxes $300. So we were leaving more billions on the table in tax money than we were taking up. We don't even have a service tax that some states have. And that Mike Fanning and I got together when we realized that the legislature was going the wrong way. They wanted to use the found money to reduce taxes. They're not even paying their bills, and they want to use the found money to reduce taxes. So we worked with Fanning for a year, raising hell, and had a rally. Becci, we're going to show those clips as soon as I shut up. Yep, she's nodding her head. And so we had a wonderful rally that turned out a bunch of people. But the thing is that Fanning ran for Senate against a Democratic in a county that's 60% Black, that had never had Black representation since Reconstruction. And so Fanning's white. And he's running against a Democratic senator who was the nephew, no, he was the cousin. Creighton Coleman was senator. His cousin or relative was the chair of the county council, and the council's son was the representative. There's 3 people from the same family had all the seats you could have represented in there. And they'd all been to the Christian Academy to avoid going to public schools. And so we thought this was a pretty good shot. And so Mike ran against the Democrat and got into a runoff with him. And the Democrat was calling people saying, you know, Fanning's married to a black woman, which made real clear that race is more important than politics to that guy. And he wanted to keep that seat no matter what. And so Mike won. And Mike has been the progressive voice for education in the legislature. And I would suggest that if nothing else, I'm going to help Mike, because his district was one of the ones that's been gerrymandered out of existence just about. He's going to have a rough hoe winning, a rough row to hoe, and we need to help him. So that's Alex.
Right, can I just add real quickly on the Fanning
Please.
matter, that he is one of the best senators that we have had in my memory here. And I know that's not saying a whole lot, but I'm just saying that is an example of how we can make a difference electorally, if by being really strategic. And I remember being in meetings when we decided to work for him. People were talking at that time, they were all talking about national politics. So all of the talk was about who are we going to endorse in the presidential thing. And I'm like, you know, that is really all of that's going to do is divide us further. We can't make any difference on that. You do you, and like, let's focus at home, which was again an example of really how South Carolina Progressive Network and the PAC and all the other work that we're doing, the school, is very, very intentionally state-based and state-focused. That is where your energy really needs to be. And it's so easy for people working in that arena, electoral politics, to get focused on, you know, congressional seats and DC, what's happening in the White House. But please, please remember the importance of working for your candidates here at home, because he is an excellent example of that investment of time and energy on our part. He has been our best advocate. So that's all. And I just love him so much.
And we will bring him to you soon. He's just a
I was
delight.
getting ready to say so. Our next step is.
Our next,
Okay.
well, our next step is hopefully we'll have Fanning at Penn Center with us. But that I wanted to kind of wrap it up by talking about this fellow that won the election in 2016. That was a year that, what Becky just mentioned, we had people going out and knocking on doors to get them to vote for Bernie Sanders in the primary for healthcare for all. This is a state that hadn't even passed Medicaid extension to get our own money back. And so we were working one side of the street on a very real thing that a Democratic governor could actually deliver our federal money to get, well, at least 250,000 people out of the emergency room, make them healthier. All the homeless people to have health care and medical care and health and mental care. And that the Bernie people were out selling something they couldn't possibly produce. And that's that disconnect of trying to like fix DC when we ain't got SC fixed. So that's one of the really serious takeaways, that we've got to, our strategy and our tactics have to match where our feet touch the ground when they touch the ground. And if not, we're being we're wrong. And so let's see. Oh yes, we had a rally the day after Trump was inaugurated. It was going to rain, and then we had reserved the tin roof, big music hall that was a part of the music farm within sight of the State House. And we had 2,000 people inside and 2,000 people outside in 43 organizations. And that was pretty much the last time that we did some big event that really worked, because the pandemic was not far behind us. We started working on the Fair Maps thing. That was a plan to undo gerrymandering that doesn't rely on the courts or the legislature, which is that's the only path that we actually could control. The Fair Maps plan is still up there. We introduced that bill in 2018 for a constitutional amendment to let the citizens draw the lines. And there's a 30-something page bill of the specifics as to how that would happen, that it took us 2 years to work up. And in 2020, we were going to launch it. And we did launch it, but it was January 2020, the first day of the legislature. And we had a whole bunch of people that had a gauntlet where the legislators come up from their offices to go up to the Senate and the House. And they all had to go through this gauntlet where somebody was holding their district with their name with the fact they got 98% of the vote. 3% of the legislators got 90+%. And so
Brett, can I play that clip real quick? Because it's got Fanning in it and we're running out.
do it.
Okay. Let me see if I can figure out it.
Okay. While she's figuring that out, I would tell you that the bill still is introduced, and it's something that we.
Which bill?
Hang on. I'm sorry. Here we go. It's short. Hey guys. Hello. 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 Hello.
Hello.
To the age level we're working with.
Hello, everybody. Hello. Hey, Hey, Senator.
Nice to see you as well. Hey, here we go.
Oh, he did. Woo! Hey, guys. Hello. Hello.
That was my Fanning. But he went on to give a really great pitch, and we had Tom Rice from Beaufort has been one of the supporters of this, and he was Mark Sanford's chief of staff. And like Sanford, he's like a genuine libertarian that there's very, very few of them that actually can defend what they believe in, as opposed to just believing in what it is to get them reelected. And so I wanted to like wrap this up and have some time for people to ask questions, but want to point out that during the pandemic, we took apart the bylaws for the Progressive Network that were written in 1996, that we were a progressive network. We were a statewide coalition of, at one point we had 63 organizations. None of those organizations exist anymore, with the exception of the national organizations that have staff. They're our allies, but they have national agendas. And so while we welcome them and we'll continue to work with them in ways where our paths cross, we really do have to have a kind of when you're a free agent to be able to do that which it is that we feel we need to do at the time it needs to be done. And so that's where we are now with the Progressive Network C4, which is the individual membership. We put that on the shelf because I had to make a decision. I'm 75 this year. Becci's been working in the same job for 32 years. We put our home up to buy this building. We started the school to teach people to be able to pick this up and move it. And we decided to separate the individual membership from the leadership, which was just me. They have, if to be effective, it needs its own director. It needs its own leadership. And so we made it an orphan. And we hope that you will organize and pull that out of the fire. And we'll be sending something out with a newsletter that we've been really remiss in communicating with people because we just can't keep up with it. That's why we had to give that up, because keeping the nonprofit, the C3 alive, owning this building and setting it up where it's paid for, where it's a turnkey operation, where you can see the young people coming in now that we're working with, there's got to be something here, an institution that carries us forward. That's what we started to grow in 77, 78. That's what we're starting here, but we really need your help. And so you will be getting more information about what we're going to do this year. And we need not just your participation, but your leadership. I'm ready to be fired, folks. And so I want to see there's questions. Becci, you want to show another clip, or you want to, how do you want to do it? What,
Let's take some questions.
All right, there is a question in the chat from earlier this evening, and I think it's still pretty relevant right now. The question is, Brett and Becky, what in your years of experience has been your go-to conversational tool when challenging a right winger to reconsider their position on an issue? In other words, how do you let someone know you love them, but don't love their position on issues in hopes of changing their mind?
I had that conversation just a couple days ago. Becky, you want me to do that?
Well, let me,
Yeah,
I'll
it
just,
was the guy that we're renting a dumpster from, and he wanted to know what my business was, and I told him how I thought, we were talking about, I think he's a veteran, and I asked him what his MOS was, which is your military operations special, and knew enough about military to him to think I was a veteran. I said, yeah, I'm a Vietnam era veteran. I fought to keep you out of the rice paddies. We're all manipulated by the same game. It's called money, and he was right there, boom, right there with me. And so you got to find a way that you touch them to what they feel. There's an old saying for organizers, you got to find where they itch so you can scratch it. Next question. If there's no questions, we're going to start showing movies. Becky, do Mob the Lobby or some stirring thing, the moral budget thing. We used to have fun, folks. A lot more fun.
Well, actually, I see Randall's hand is.
Well, Hannah's hand went up first.
Sorry, mine's very brief. Does the Christian Coalition still exist, and does it go by a different name now?
Say again?
Does the Christian Coalition that you were talking about, does that go by the same name?
Yeah, it's called MAGA.
Oh, okay. I didn't know.
No, seriously.
If it still existed, or if it was like
Yeah.
Pat
like an
Robertson,
official, like organized thing.
Pat Robertson just died. God bless him. May he find the gates of hell locked.
I didn't know if you were talking about like an official like organization or like a larger culture.
I am not aware of one that's been cohesive in the last number of years, and I really do think that this Christian nationalism and the prosperity gospel have come together and are supporting the Make America Great Again.
With taxpayers' money going to.
No, Robert.
All right, Randall, go ahead, please.
Brett, you dog, you. I've been feeling guilty because many weeks ago, when you and I were talking, I don't know if it was on the phone, but I mentioned my disappointment with the Progressive Caucus in the state Democratic Party, because I thought they were holly-go-lightly and they didn't have a clue as to getting things done in some practical manner. And then you were going on about the progressives, and I thought, I just insulted the man. But now tonight you reveal that you agreed with me about the idea you have to have feet on the ground and objective in your scope to get things done. And that's exactly what I was complaining about before. You
Thank you,
dog.
Randall. We're obviously both playing the same note. And that recently the last convention that was just this April was the first time there's been a serious challenge against Jim Clyburn's rule. And I can say serious because Brandon Upson, I talked to him, I said, Brandon, you want to lead the party, you got to run against the party. And he did. And Gilda Cobb-Hunter gave his introduction, nominated his speech right after Clyburn. Clyburn's standing right there, and Gilda comes up and gives the nomination, and that has not happened before.
Ooh, child.
That has not happened. And so, yeah, we're still there, but it's going to take some of you it's hard, damn it. You got to go to the precinct meeting, you get elected to go to the county meeting, you get elected to go to the state meeting, all just to run against the party. But that's what you got to do. That's what the Republicans did when they took over the executive committee of the South Carolina Republican Party, and it went completely batshit. Next question. Or show a film, Becky. Where'd she go?
Oh, there, she moved.
Work with you. But Donna DeWitt and Joni, they're working to build this thing. A democratic movement that represents the interest of people. A good political force grows from an organized popular movement. We have to make that movement. We have to show people that it makes a difference to care. And the way that you can do that most immediately is by being in that building this coming Monday at 11:30. This shirt that I have on. You can own one of these shirts if you come to the lobby at 11:30. You can pick them up on the other side of the Confederate flag. And I want to say that I've been here in South Carolina competing with third world countries for the last 30 or 40 years. Telling people up north, y'all come on down, our workers is stupid, they work cheap, we smash unions, we don't have any environmental regulations, come on down. And you know what's happening now, folks, with Nikki Haley? She's deciding we do not have to compete with third world nations, we can be one.
That's what you feel in the news.
I said there were 400 people out on the step with signs, and
Joe Neal.
a group of them at that moment were in the lobby and started chanting, which is not allowed.
Stop the cuts! Stop the cuts! Stop the cuts!
And the speaker's eyes got this big. I said, they're coming. so he said, we'll work out something. Okay, so we, instead of having 20% cuts, we had what?
5% cuts.
And a lot of things didn't get cut that would have gotten cut. So a lot of it, whether it received any press or not, that rally had an impact.
Well, we don't have much time left here. We have one more class where we're going to talk about, and we want you to come prepared to discuss, what the hell are you going to do now?
Heard that.
And Modjeska said, this is no sitting down time. And if you're, I'm so lucky to have grown up at a time when they wanted me to go kill people around the world or go to jail. My card was called, and that's one of the things that the American government learned not to do. We now have a economic draft. We have a volunteer army. We use third world mercenaries, and we're insulating. We're trying to keep the resistance here at home down by doing things like that. That's getting harder. We've got some times coming that are going to be different than we've ever seen. They were talking today about the Justice Department deciding not to prosecute Trump for the violations he did because they were afraid it would cause a civil war. So all I can say is we got to get a little more organized here and are needing your help. And so that's all I got to say, Dr. Green. I'm going to turn it back to you.
Okay, so two things. Number one, we are about to also view a short video on Juneteenth. Another quick reminder, of course, we do have our final class next Monday, this coming Sunday from 4 to 6 or so. Oh, we're not having it? Not doing? Okay. So next week we have our final class, and then next Saturday we have our graduation. Don't forget though, in terms of memorials and holidays and such and things to remember, today, of course, is Juneteenth. 2 days ago was the anniversary of the Charleston Massacre in 2015. And so Brett just mentioned some of the challenges we're facing right now. As he's pointed out, as Justice Simkins herself used to say, this is no sitting down time. And I got to tell you, as a historian of American history, we are in a pretty perilous situation. That's the bad news. The good news is that all of us in this room and all of us on Zoom are deeply committed to the fundamental idea that all human life has dignity. That's something that's not always remembered in South Carolina, but it's something that we will continue to fight for.